As days passed, the walls around Amina began closing in. She was desperate to pull herself free from Dante's grip, but every attempt only seemed to tighten his hold on her. When she finally mustered the courage to tell him she wanted out, Dante's reaction chilled her. His calm smile vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating gaze she'd never seen before. "You think you can just walk away?" he said quietly, his voice laced with an underlying threat. "After everything I've shared with you? After everything you know?" Amina's heart raced as she realized just how deeply he had trapped her. It wasn't only her life she was risking. Dante had a way of reminding her of the leverage he held, the secrets she'd confided in him, and how easily he could destroy everything she held dear. She felt his gaze linger on her, and with each passing second her fear grew. She knew that backing out was no longer an option. At home, Michael's suspicions intensified. One evening, he confronted her directly. "Amina, I know something's wrong," he said, his voice strained, his eyes full of a hurt. "I feel like I'm losing you, but I don't know why." Amina froze, unable to meet his gaze, the guilt clawing at her. She wanted to tell him everything to finally break free from the lies, but fear held her back. How could she confess to the man she once loved that she'd risked their life together for something so reckless? Torn between the two worlds she'd created, Amina felt trapped. She was no longer the woman she used to be, and she couldn't go back. Every choice she made had pushed her further into a life that was unraveling. Each day, she wrestled with the decision to confess or to stay silent and risk losing herself entirely. She knew that the price of her silence was destroying her marriage and her friendships, yet the fear of Dante's power kept her paralyzed. In her pursuit of excitement, she had found herself in a nightmare where every choice carried devastating consequences, and there was no way to undo the damage. Amina's life had become an endless cycle of fear and regret. The walls of secrecy she'd built were crumbling, and she could feel the pressure closing in, ready to burst. One evening, just as she was preparing to leave for yet another tense visit with Dante, Michael stopped her. His face was pale, his voice a whisper of hurt and confusion. "I know where you've been going, Amina," he said, his voice barely steady. "I know you've been visiting him." Amina's heart dropped, a cold wave of panic washing over her. She couldn't find the words, couldn't explain herself. She saw the betrayal in Michael's eyes, the devastation of realizing she had been living a double life. Before she could answer, Michael shook his head, his voice breaking. "I never thought you'd risk everything we have for this." He turned away, leaving her alone with the weight of her choices crushing her. Still shaken, Amina drove to the prison. She knew she had to confront Dante, to finally put an end to the tangled web she'd allowed herself to be trapped in. But when she arrived, Dante's demeanor was different. He looked at her with an unsettling calm, as though he knew exactly what she was about to say. Before she could speak, he leaned in, his voice dripping with disdain. "If you think you can walk away, think again," he whispered. He reminded her of every secret she'd confided, every word he could twist, every consequence he could unleash. Desperation filled Amina as she realized there was no easy way out. She was faced with an impossible choice. Expose herself, admit to her family and friends everything she had done, or continue in Dante's world, bound by the fear of his control. Her heart pounded as she realized this was the price of her thrill-seeking, a price that threatened to destroy every relationship, every part of her identity. She was left standing in that cold room, realizing that no matter what choice she made, she'd already lost the life she once knew. Amina drove home from the prison that night, her mind a blur of fear and regret. Dante's threat echoed in her head. the terrifying reminder that she was no longer just a volunteer or a curious woman seeking excitement. She was complicit. She had given him everything he needed to control her, and now she felt there was no way out. The image of Michael's devastated face flashed before her, his unspoken question haunting her. Why? When she arrived home, the house was silent, heavy with a tension that had been building for weeks. She found Michael sitting at the kitchen table, his eyes fixed on the floor, unable to look at her. Gathering every ounce of courage she had, Amina sat across from him and took a deep breath. "Michael," she began, her voice shaking, "I know I've hurt you, and I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But please, let me explain." She told him everything. How she'd felt invisible, trapped in the monotony of their life. How volunteering had been her way to escape the numbness. She confessed how she'd let herself be drawn to Dante, how she'd been lured by the thrill he offered, and how it had all spiraled beyond her control. She felt her heart sink as Michael's expression shifted from hurt to anger to a hollow kind of resignation. "I trusted you, Amina," he whispered, his voice breaking. "And you risked everything for someone who doesn't even care about you." Just then, her phone buzzed, the screen flashing with a message from an unknown number. She froze, knowing it was Dante. She had tried to cut ties, but he wasn't letting go. The message was a chilling reminder of the hold he had over her. "Remember what's at stake. Don't make me remind you." Realizing she had reached her breaking point, Amina looked at Michael, her eyes pleading. "Help me," she whispered. "I need you. I can't do this alone." For the first time, she saw a glimmer of understanding in his eyes, a recognition that she was just as trapped as he was now. Together, they made a decision: to confront Dante and put an end to the nightmare once and for all. With a plan in place, Amina felt a strange mix of dread and relief. She was terrified of the confrontation that lay ahead, but she was ready to reclaim her life, whatever it took. The next day, Amina and Michael prepared themselves for the confrontation that would either free them or bind them deeper into Dante's world. Michael's support gave Amina the strength she needed, even though the fear still gnawed at her. Together, they arranged a meeting with Dante under the guise of one last visit. Amina knew this was risky, but it was the only way to confront him and end the twisted power he held over her. When they arrived at the prison, Amina felt her heart race. The once familiar visitation room now felt like a cage, closing in around her. Dante entered, his usual smirk replaced with a cold, calculating look. He instantly noticed Michael sitting beside her, and his eyes narrowed. "So, you brought backup?" he sneered, his voice low and threatening. Amina met his gaze, her fear replaced by a newfound resolve. "This ends now, Dante. You've controlled me long enough, but I'm done being afraid of you." Dante leaned forward, his tone icy. "Do you really think it's that easy? You think you can just walk away? I have enough on you to ruin everything." But Amina didn't flinch. She held his gaze, drawing strength from Michael's presence beside her. "If you try to hurt us, everything will come out." "I'm not afraid anymore," she said firmly, her voice steady. Dante's smirk faltered, a flicker of frustration crossing his face as he realized his hold on her was slipping. He tried once more, leaning closer, his voice dripping with menace. "You don't understand who you're dealing with." But this time, Amina remained unshaken. "No, Dante," she said, her voice steady. "I think you're the one who doesn't understand." Seeing his control crumble, Dante finally recoiled, his anger visible as the power dynamic shifted. Amina and Michael stood up, leaving Dante in that cold room, powerless. As they walked out of the prison together, Amina felt a heavy weight lift off her shoulders. She had reclaimed her life, and though the road ahead wouldn't be easy, she knew she would face it with strength and clarity. The hold Dante once had over her was gone, leaving her free to rebuild, to heal, and to start anew. Walking out of the prison that day felt like a rebirth for Amina. The air felt lighter, and the constant fear that had loomed over her for months was finally gone. But as she glanced at Michael beside her, she realized the journey to healing would be long and uncertain. The silence between them was heavy, filled with everything left unsaid. They drove home without speaking, each lost in their own thoughts, processing what had just unfolded. Once home, Amina sat down across from Michael in their living room, the same room that had once been filled with laughter and warmth but now felt distant. "Michael?" she began softly. "I know I can't undo what I've done. I know I hurt you, and I don't expect forgiveness overnight. But I want to try to make things right, to be honest this time, and rebuild what I've broken." Her voice was thick with regret, but there was also a sense of hope, a glimmer of the love they'd once shared. Michael looked at her, his face a mix of exhaustion and sadness. "Amina, it's going to take time. You put our life at risk. You put us both at risk," he said, his tone soft but firm. He took a deep breath, struggling with the weight of it all. "But I'm willing to try, if you are." Amina nodded, feeling a warmth she hadn't felt in a long time. She understood that, while she had escaped Dante's control, the work to rebuild her relationship with Michael was just beginning. Over the next weeks, Amina and Michael faced the difficult process of rebuilding their lives together. They sought counseling, talking through the layers of hurt and mistrust that had built up. Through honesty and vulnerability, they slowly rediscovered the bond they once had, each recognizing the flaws and weaknesses that had led them down this path. Though Amina still carried guilt and remorse, she found strength in Michael's willingness to work through it with her. The experience had changed them both, and they knew they would never be the same. But in the ashes of what they'd lost, they began to find a new foundation, a raw, unfiltered honesty that neither had allowed before. Amina would carry the scars of her choices, but she was no longer defined by them. She had taken control of her life, reclaimed her sense of self, and learned the power of forgiveness. And with Michael by her side, she was finally ready to leave the shadows of her past behind and step into the future together. Months later, Amina stood in her living room, looking around at the familiar walls that now held a new meaning for her. She and Michael had managed to rebuild a life together, one founded not on perfection, but on resilience and understanding. The laughter had returned slowly, and though shadows lingered, they were no longer overwhelming. She'd learned that healing wasn't about forgetting the past, but about accepting it, learning from it, and allowing it to shape a stronger future. Michael had become her closest confidant again, and through each painful conversation, each hard-fought moment of forgiveness, they rediscovered a trust that was now deeper than before. They still had moments of doubt, times when the scars would resurface, but they faced those moments together, committed to moving forward. The experience had made them realize that real love was often imperfect, forged through trials and setbacks. Their love had survived something that could have broken it, and that was its strength. As she looked at Michael, Amina felt a quiet peace. She was no longer the woman caught in Dante's web, nor the one seeking excitement in the wrong places. She was a woman who had confronted her own weaknesses and emerged stronger, humbled but hopeful. With Michael by her side, she was ready for whatever lay ahead. Together, they had learned that life's most profound lessons often came from our darkest moments, and in those lessons they had found a new beginning.